domestic regulator. Okay, anyway, enough of that. When it comes to regulation, our next guest is absolutely at the forefront of giants in international economics, politics, and world events. He has been elected 5 times, and we'll talk about that, by his people. He led his country through some of the most difficult times that any nation could have ever faced. He is still one of those people that every time I meet, I simply say, wow. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm welcome to the President of Iceland. Good to see you. Very good. President Grimson, now. Good to see you, Mr. President.
Same here.
I am going to say that we'll take as many questions as we can. Are you okay? You're comfortable with that?
Sure, absolutely.
Because I think it's hashtag GLS 2013, and while we wait for questions to come in for you, and we'll also take many questions from the audience here, it's worth saying at the moment, you're in a bit of a conundrum at the moment, because you've just had an election, you've asked one party to produce a government, but they haven't yet.
No, but I think they will in the next few days. And politics in my country are always coalition politics. So you have to get agreements among at least 2 or maybe more parties. But I selected the leader of the Progressive Party, who campaigned mainly on dealing with the household debt of the population and pressurizing those vulture funds, or whatever you want to call them, into not realizing the extraordinary profit they want to make out of the Icelandic banking crisis. So it was a very interesting democratic victory, and therefore I gave him the mandate to try to lead the next government, and I think he is about to succeed in the next few days.
The voters in your country went in the diametrically opposed direction. They rejected many of the measures, the austerity measures in many cases, that were put in place by the previous government.
No, I wouldn't say that they rejected the austerity measures, because one area where we did things differently in Iceland in the last 4 years is that we have not introduced the similar kind of austerity measures that are now being recommended and have been recommended in other European countries. We try to save the welfare services, especially for those who have the lowest income. And that was one of the combination of measures that the IMF recognized, that maybe they learned more from Iceland than we actually learned from them.
Everybody is turning to Iceland as an example from that crisis. Now, if we go back to 2007, 2008, 2009, when the crisis hit, the fundamental decision to let the banks go, to let them go bankrupt, and at one point, 99% of your banks were basically bankrupt.
Well, I think before we come to answering that question, I think it's important for the audience to realize, and maybe some remember, that in the final months of 2008, after the collapse of the banks and the early weeks of 2009, my nation, which is the most democratically peaceful, open, secure nation probably in Europe, was rising up in such a way that for the first time in our history, we had riots every day. We had fires burning in front of the parliament. We had the police force having to defend the central bank and the parliament and the prime minister's office. We saw a situation where perhaps our entire democratic and social fabric was breaking down. And to me, it was probably one of the most dramatic examples in recent history that the failure of financial markets can fundamentally threaten European and Western democracies in a way we have never imagined before. And if you need the proof of the democratic and social responsibility of the financial market, the case of Iceland 4 or 5 years ago is a very good example.
So the decision then to let the banks go, rather than say try and prop them up? I mean, actually, there wasn't any hope of propping them up. They had to let them
No, of course there was a possibility, and for about a week or so, that was one of the issues that we actually debated. But over 80% of the business of the Icelandic banks was out of Iceland. And we therefore decided to let the banks go. And that was against the current opinion that was prevailing in Europe. And as you remember, Ireland went in a different direction.
Would you have advised Ireland to do what you did?
Yes, I would, because quite frankly, I can't understand why banks are being considered the holy churches of the modern economy, that private banks cannot go bankrupt like a normal company, because that's basically what they are. But we are treating them as if somehow they are the privileged entities of our economies. So while we let other companies go bankrupt, and there's no national debate about it, we decided to let the banks go that way as well. And in addition to that, we introduced a number of other measures which were contrary to the prevailing orthodoxies in the last 30 or 40 years of the Western financial world. We introduced currency controls. We, as I said before, didn't introduce austerity measures of the scale that were demanded 10 or 20 years ago, or still being demanded in Europe. And we let the banks fail. And all of these were considered to be principles and policies that were not accepted by, for example, the European leadership at that time.
Would it? Is the experiment or the policies that you introduced workable in a nation, a beautiful nation of 300,000-400,000? But if you were to let the banks go in Italy or in Spain, you would have had a systemic failure within the European banking system.
Well, that is the theory, you see, but it hasn't been proven.
Well, that's because we haven't let them go.
No, I think it would be very interesting to list the number of banks that have been allowed to fail in European countries in the last 4 or 5 years. But you see, when the British and the Dutch government, supported by every EU government, took the stand that the people of Iceland should bail out the iSave issue here in Britain and be made responsible for the failure of the private bank. That was done in the spirit of what you said, that if we allowed that bank to go bankrupt and not take the responsibility by the state, then the whole financial system would collapse. I don't accept that argument, and I don't accept the argument that because we are small, somehow we can apply policies that are not applicable in other countries. Iceland is a highly advanced market economy and operates in a very open way in the global system. For example, we have just recently made the first free trade agreement with China. So for all practical purposes, we are similar to every other European economy.
As a president, you are far from a figurehead. You are activist, interventionist, and you have had no compunction, whether it's on a media law or twice, in rejecting Parliament's legislation in terms of paying back bailout monies. Have you pushed the spirit of your position to the edge?
Oh no, of course not, because our political system is based on the principle that sovereignty is with the people, and the will of the Icelandic nation, not the Parliament, should actually be paramount. And I think your question points towards a very important core element of the present financial crisis of the last 4 or 5 years, is that somehow we assumed in the previous 30 or 40 years that financial progress and democracy would go hand in hand. But this financial crisis brought us to a crossroad where there was a fundamental conflict between the perceived interest of the financial market and the democratic principles, the will of the people on the other hand. And when I made my decision on the iSave issue, my final analysis, after I swept every policy aspect away, was that I was faced with the choice of deciding what's more important, the financial interest of the market or the democratic will of the people.
Even though Parliament had passed this legislation twice, and you chose to veto it.
Yes, but Parliament partly passed the legislation because the Gordon Brown government, supported by every European government, used the board of the IMF for the most elaborate high-level financial blackmail I have ever witnessed in recent history, maintaining that if we didn't agree to make the ordinary people of Iceland responsible for the failure of a private bank in Britain, the IMF program for Iceland would actually been stopped, and it was for over a year. And that was the main reason why the government at that time and the Parliament thought that they had to make a deal. But the interesting fact now is that we know, because it has been tested, that this policy, which was supported by every European government, and they have not faced up to answering now why they were so wrong, turned out to be economically wrong, democratically wrong, and the EFTA court has ruled in the beginning of this year that it was also legally wrong. But 4 or 5 years ago, every government in the European Union supported that line. And I think in order to help Europe to get out of this deep crisis, at least intellectually, they should ask themselves the question, why were they so wrong in this fundamental case if it was even illegal within the European financial system to ask the people of Iceland to be responsible for the failure of a private bank?
You are, I shall choose my words in presidential terms.
Yes. It's high time for you, Richard, to show some presidential respect.
You were spitting feathers over the way your country was treated, particularly by Gordon Brown.
No, I'm not. No, I was educated in this country. I have admired.
You were angry?
I was more than angry. I was like, I was like every Icelander, profoundly offended, because in addition to trying to blackmail us with respect to the banking debt of one Icelandic private bank, the Gordon Brown government used the terrorist legislation in Britain to put Iceland formally on the terrorist list, together with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. No, it's true, on the official website of the British government. And this meant that every line of business for every Icelandic company anywhere in the world was stopped. Because at that time, everybody believed Gordon Brown, but not us. I mean, fortunately, that's no longer the situation. And therefore, we have been able to show people that the action taken by this government, and I say again, not because I want to criticize the European Union governments, but I think it's very important in order for themselves to get out of their quagmire today, that they realized how wrong the stand was for almost a year. But as I say to you, we are proud to being a country which is based on a solid democratic position. We don't have an army. We have a very small police force. I live in a residence with no guard whatsoever. I perhaps shouldn't say so publicly, but I use it here in order to indicate how peaceful my country is. And then to put us together with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban on the official website of Downing Street and the Treasury was to us such a cultural long that it will be remembered in Icelandic history for centuries to come. Long after Gordon Brown is completely forgotten in this country.
Who? If the European Union leaders did not understand or realize what was happening or why they were making those decisions, why do you think they did it? Why do you think they erroneously have gone down these paths? Is it incompetence? Is it malfeasance, or is it simple stupidity?
Well, I think in Gordon Brown's case, it was a political expediency. But for the other leaders, I think, like many of us, in fact, prior to the banking crisis, we had accepted most of the prevailing financial and economic theories which had been taught in the business schools and the universities and had been practiced by almost every Western government for the last 30 years. And when the crisis hit, the European leaders assumed that this was kind of a classical financial crisis. But somehow we in Iceland were fortunate to realize that it was not so. That this was a profound social, political, and democratic crisis. And unless we introduced reforms in all these areas and allowed the people to come to the decision-making table, we would never be able to galvanize the nation out of this profound shock. So I think the problem with the European approach, at least until last year, was that they didn't realize the many profound dimensions of this crisis.
I want to take questions because I did promise. Let's have the house lights up. And who's got a question for the President? And whilst, let's have, if I may respectfully leave you there, sir, for a moment, I shall come into the audience. Yes, gentleman in the middle. We haven't got a mic. Oh, there's a microphone just here. And if you have a question, just catch my eye at this point is a good moment to. Yes.
Thank you for that leadership and great comments. It seems to me part of the problem is that the corporate sector, the banking sector, for example, captures politicians and regulators and cognitively, if nothing else. Clearly, that didn't happen in Iceland's case. What's your advice to regulators and politicians not to be captured?
I didn't get the core of the question, so maybe you
The
can
core of the question
repeat
is, what's your advice to regulators who failed in the European situations? What would your advice to regulators be?
Well, I have often been asked, why did I support the Icelandic banks for a number of years leading up to the financial crisis? Why didn't I accept the warning signals and listen to the critical voices that were being sounded by some people? Of course, I heard them, but I made the mistake that first I checked with the rating agencies. I listened to what Standard & Poor's and Fitch and Moody's, what they were saying. And they all gave the Icelandic banks a complete bill of health. And then I looked at what the predominant European and American banks were doing with respect to the Icelandic banks. And they were all doing extensive business with the Icelandic banks and wanted to increase it. And there was no regulatory authority anywhere that gave us a wake-up call. And that has led me to conclude that the rating agencies, the warning mechanism within the major banks, as well as the regulators, have to be reformed in a fundamental way, because if they failed in the case of Iceland, why are they suddenly right today?
Right. One more. One.
Okay. Tobias Gornum, LBS alumni. Imagine you were the president not of Iceland, but of the European Union with similar powers. Obviously, that's totally just a mind game. Imagine you were in this position. What would you do now for the next few months to help the European Union overcome this crisis?
All right, so you've got Barroso's or Van Rompuy's job. What would you do?
No, better ones. With the powers you have right now in Iceland. I think that's a little bit better than Barroso's job.
Well, I've been asked many questions in my career, but never one like this.
I think this is a compliment.
Well, like the head of Unilever said earlier in this session, that he decided on his first day to abolish the short-term view. My position is that this whole ideology of Europe is the main policy straitjacket. That people talk as if there is an entity and a playing field called Europe that needs to be strengthened. How often do you hear that in Northern Europe there is a relatively prevailing economic success, that most of Northern Europe is outside the Eurozone for different reasons? And if you look at the Northern European countries, perhaps apart from Britain, they have not faced the crisis that the other European countries face. And I found it revealing what Ackerman said here this morning, that when he was asked questions by Richard, that are similar to the one you are putting to me, he said Europe is all about a role on the global stage. That is an ideology of power, not the vision of progress or economic prosperity. So I think probably the first thing I would try to do is to get Europe out of this ideological straitjacket and get down to the level of where people live and fight for their daily existence and the right to determine their own future. Because Europe's primary legacy to the world is not financial markets. Europe's primary legacy that is given to the world is democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And why should Europe, when it faces a fundamental crisis for itself, not go the way of its most important contribution to the world and try to play, because of some power role on the so-called global stage in the coming decades, a financial roulette, which clearly is not producing any results?
You must be pleased. You must be pleased that as a result of this last election in your country, the membership of the European Union call, or clarion movement, has been rolled back. It is less likely that Iceland will join anytime soon, if at all.
No, you're right. I mean, that was a clear outcome of the election, that there is an overwhelming, at least two-thirds majority in the new parliament from parties that are fundamentally against Iceland joining the European Union. And it is also an interesting fact, coming back to the mosaic picture of Europe, that our neighbor to the east, Norway, has twice voted no to European Union membership. And our neighbor to the west, Greenland, which, by the way, is half the size of Europe, people tend to forget that, actually left the European Union some decades ago. And for the very similar reasons, I didn't see it in my country's interest to join the European Union. And the party that had membership in the Eurozone and the European Union at its core election campaign lost more in this last election than any political party has lost in the history of European election in the post-war period.
With this, there's a question on the tweet line which basically says, what do you think, what does the President, do you see any parallels and do you have any advice for the situation in Cyprus?
No, I have been very hesitant to offer direct advice to other countries for the reason that I listen to so many ill-informed advice to my country from other people. So what I can do is to describe the experience of my country in a very honest and very frank way and present that to other people and let them then draw their own conclusions. But I find it interesting that when the three pillars of the European international financial system were dealing with Cyprus, they, in the end, came out with policy recommendations that were considered absolute taboo 4 or 5 years ago with respect to my country. So they have, in fact, moved 180 degrees in terms of their recommendations and the policies that they are introducing in Cyprus. But what is lacking is the honest, intellectual, political, economic examination within the European institutions of the fundamental failure which the last 4 or 5 years have produced.
Why do you think they won't have that? Is it because they're afraid, or because they're the same people who will be found wanting and should go?
No, I don't think so, Richard. I think when we look at European history or even international history, we have seen periods where the prevailing ideology, as we call it, the kind of herd spirit of the political economic establishment, somehow adopts a roadmap which they believe is the fundamental truth. We have seen many examples of that in the last 100 years or so in European history. And that is why I refer to this ideology of Europe, that when you ask people honest intellectual questions about the failure of this, they start talking about the future of Europe, about the role on the global stage, which is not an answer to this question. So I don't believe there is a conspiracy. I don't believe it is out of malice. I simply believe, like in many other times in European history, they are victims to an ideological prison.
5 times you have been elected president, I believe.
Yes.
That's a long time.
Too long. But
You're still there. I mean...
Yes, I'm still there, but I declared in my New Year's address more than a year ago that I wanted the freedom to do other things.
You said that before?
No, I'd never said that before. That was the main message on the 1st of January in 2012. But then I decided to go to Antarctica to look at the climate change at the courtesy of Al Gore and a number of scientists. And while I was in Antarctica, some people started a petition asking me to run again. And when I came back, it was up and running. And in the end, almost 20% of the Icelandic electorate signed that petition. And for me, it was fundamentally a moral question, because I was looking forward to the freedom of being able to do what I wanted to do. But then I came to the conclusion that if the people have shown you this trust of electing you a number of times, and they want you to stay with them, you have almost a moral obligation, a democratic obligation to do that, irrespective of your own personal wishes. And that was the honest examination, because in terms of my own freedom, in terms of my own financial security, it would have been a much better option to actually leave office.
Will there be a 6th term? Not difficult?
No. Of course, it will not be a 6th term. Because democratically, it's not good. What I'm pleased about when this new government will be formed, hopefully by the end of this week, will be a new generation of Icelanders coming into the ministries. It will be people who have learned difficult lessons from the financial crisis, but also have a vision to move forward. And by the time when this term is at its end, in 3 years' time, I think the best service I can do to my nation and to its democracy is to let other people serve in this office, but then hopefully with good health, move on to some of these important issues.
And when you do leave office, it will have been 20 years since somebody else had held the office. So there aren't too many predecessors for your successor to turn to for advice. What will be your single piece of advice to your successor?
Well, of course I could give you a complicated, long analytical list. But looking back on these years, and my previous years in politics, also as a Minister of Finance, the fundamental truth I have learned is to trust the wisdom of the people, the ordinary people, and to respect the wisdom of the ordinary people in a fundamental, almost old-fashioned democratic way. I think we are too much subjected to elaborate mechanism of spin and PR and all these advices to people who are elected to serve. But fundamentally, ordinary people have somehow an inner wisdom to tell you when you're wrong and when you're right. Abraham Lincoln said it in a much more elegant way in his time, as we all know. So my fundamental advice would be trust the people. Trust the inner wisdom of the ordinary people.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
He may not have any guards. He may not have any guards at his house. But he has a very large dog that will lick you to death. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of what I think we have to all agree has been an absolutely stunning day of discussion.